In the early 20th century, when physics was still searching for the keys to the universe, and the atom was treated as a vast unknown, a man was born who would later carry one of the heaviest burdens in history. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man who would stand between science and politics, between genius and guilt, between knowledge and catastrophe. Every time he tried to escape his fate, he found himself moving closer to the eye of the storm. Oppenheimer was born in New York City in 1904, into a Jewish immigrant family from Germany. His father, who started life as a simple laborer, had become a successful businessman, while his mother was an artist interested in painting and culture. In this home where literature and art mingled, the child Robert grew up surrounded by books, pictures, and music. From childhood, he seemed different, quiet, contemplative, holding questions in his mind too big for his age. He tended toward solitude, spending long hours with books or writing early scientific notes. When he entered school, teachers noticed his prodigious genius. He read with unusual veracity and learned languages with astonishing speed. At an early age, he mastered French, German, and Latin, and it was not long before he began reading the texts of Greek philosophers in their original language. But what captured his heart and mind was science, especially physics. This period was the age of scientific awakening, where quantum theory began to emerge, and the works of Bohr and Einstein opened new doors to understanding nature. Oppenheimer moved to Harvard University, where his intellectual energy exploded. He was not merely a gifted student, he was akin to an intellectual storm. He completed his studies in just 3 years, and his passion for knowledge led him to move from one hall to another, from chemistry to literature, and from philosophy to theoretical physics. Nevertheless, physics remained his true world, the ocean he could not resist diving into. He traveled to Europe to pursue his graduate studies. The continent was, at the time, a center for advanced scientific research, especially in Germany, where its universities were considered the destination for physicists. In the laboratories of Göttingen, he found himself among an elite group of physics giants, Max Born, Paul Dirac, Heisenberg, and others. There, in the halls of those formidable universities, he began building his name as one of the brightest young minds in theoretical physics. Despite his genius, he suffered from an unceasing inner anxiety. He lived a sharp psychological struggle between his deep desire to understand the world and a sense of existential lostness. He once wrote in a letter to a friend, "I feel as if there is an unceasing storm inside me. I don't know if it's pushing me toward knowledge or toward madness." This duality would accompany him throughout his life. Oppenheimer returned to the United States as a university professor, moving between the University of Berkeley and the California Institute of Technology. He was highly respected among the scientists of his era. He was a brilliant lecturer, presenting physics not merely as cold equations, but imbuing it with a deep philosophical spirit. His students saw him as a rare blend of scientist, thinker, and poet. Yet, he continued to live within his own world, as if observing the world from behind transparent glass. Until that time, Oppenheimer did not think about politics or war. But the world around him was changing rapidly. Europe was sinking under the shadows of Nazism, and news of racial persecution reached everywhere. He watched Hitler's rise with deep concern, knowing that science would not remain isolated from world events. Here, he began to feel that physics, the science he loved, might be turned into a weapon. In 1939, news arrived from Germany that changed the course of history, the fission of the uranium atom. This scientific experiment was like a door open to a new destiny. Scientists realized that fission meant the possibility of releasing immense energy that, if harnessed, could turn into an unprecedented weapon. The United States began to fear that the Germans would get ahead in this field, especially since some of the greatest scientists were forced to work for the Nazi regime. In this tense climate, Oppenheimer found himself at the heart of crucial discussions about the world's future. He was not inclined toward war, but he was convinced that ignoring this development meant risking the fate of the free world. When he was later invited to lead a massive secret project to develop the atomic bomb, he did not fully realize that he was entering a path of no return. The United States was looking for a leader with the ability to gather scientists and connect theoretical physics with practical application. Although Oppenheimer was not the oldest scientist of his time, his unique personality, intellectual depth, and ability to understand various branches of physics made him the ideal man for the job. Thus, in 1942, he became the scientific director of what would later be known as the Manhattan Project. But before the project could start, an entire city had to be built in the heart of the desert, a city hidden from sight called Los Alamos. In this remote spot, reachable by only one road, a group of the greatest minds in history began working day and night, in a race against time, to produce a weapon that would change the shape of war and the world. Upon arriving at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer realized he had entered a completely new world, a world unlike anything he had known before. He was no longer just a theoretical scientist, he had become a leader of hundreds of scientists, engineers, and officers. He had to impose discipline on a community of people accustomed to free thinking. He had to find solutions amidst complex technical obstacles and balance science, politics, security, and secrecy. With every passing day, he realized that the project was getting closer to the moment of truth. But he also knew that this truth would not just be a scientific achievement, but a moral burden that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The city of Los Alamos was like a microcosm born out of war. A city with no history, no past, no identity other than the identity of secrecy. A vast wall of desert encircled it, and military checkpoints guarded its entrances. There, thousands of men and women lived in complete isolation, working without daring to tell their closest ones what they were doing. Everything was surrounded by silence, and every step was subject to security scrutiny. In the midst of this isolation stood Robert Oppenheimer, the man who gathered around him some of the most brilliant scientists humanity had ever known. The project was progressing at an enormous speed, but the questions that accompanied it were more dangerous than the equations the scientists wrote on glass boards. An intellectual battle was raging in the background. What is the nature of this weapon they seek to create? Can a force released from the core of the atom be controlled? Will the world remain the same if this power comes into existence? These were not just philosophical questions, they were part of the daily scientific calculations. The very idea, transforming a small part of matter into immense energy, inspired awe in the hearts of even the most stoic scientists. Oppenheimer tried to maintain his team's morale, but internally, he lived in constant anxiety. It was not just fear of failure, but fear of success. He realized, perhaps more than anyone else in the project, that the bomb they were working on would not just be a weapon, but an event that would divide history into pre- and post-dash. He felt the weight of responsibility, but he could not turn back. He saw Nazism as a threat surpassing any moral choice, and the race against time as a necessity, not an option. As the months passed, scientific obstacles accumulated. Atomic fission was a theoretical concept, but turning it into a weapon required complex challenges, designing the explosive lens, controlling the neutrons, ensuring the stability of the fissile material, and precise calculations regarding temperature, pressure, and time. Every mistake, no matter how small, could mean the end of the project or an explosion inside the lab. Yet, Oppenheimer was capable of grasping the full picture, connecting scientists, resolving conflicts, and proposing pathways. He possessed a rare ability to understand minute details and strategic planning simultaneously. While Los Alamos was buzzing with diligent work, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and here began the question that would pursue Oppenheimer for the rest of his life: is it still necessary to use the bomb? Some scientists felt the project had lost its fundamental justification after the fall of Nazism. Others believed that Japan would not surrender without a devastating blow, and that using the new weapon might end the war quickly and save many lives. Discussions were heated, and Oppenheimer was at their center. He was not a political man in the partisan sense, but he had influence within the American administration due to his central role in the project. Nevertheless, the final decision was in the hands of the politicians and the military, not the scientists. He had no choice but to continue the work, even though he was internally torn. The moment of the test approached. The bomb had to be tested before use. Thus, a site in the New Mexico desert, called Trinity, was chosen as the location for the first nuclear explosion in history. Intensive preparations began. Wires were laid, equipment was installed, and materials were transported with extreme caution. The project's scientists lived between fear and excitement. They realized they were on the verge of entering a world humanity had never trod before. On July 16, 1945, shortly before dawn, Oppenheimer and his team stood a few miles away from a metal tower carrying the experimental bomb. The sky was dark, and only the sound of the wind broke the silence. With the countdown, there was no turning back. When the clock reached 0, the desert lit up with a light brighter than the sun. A massive explosion, a fireball that rose at a frightening speed, turning into a column of light and then a swirling cloud in the sky, as if a creature born of the cosmos's wrath. In that moment, Oppenheimer felt the world had changed. The explosion was not just a scientific success, but a declaration of a new era. The era of absolute power and absolute terror. Later, when he tried to describe what he felt, he uttered the sentence that would immortalize his name forever: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The words were a quote from the Indian texts of the Bhagavad Gita, which he had read in his youth. But it was not just a quotation, it was an explicit confession that the knowledge he had sought all his life had turned into a force he could not control. After the test, the bomb was ready for use. A few weeks later, the two bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was catastrophic, and the images that reached Los Alamos surpassed all expectations. Oppenheimer felt a deep shock. He knew the weapon's power, but he had not imagined the scale of human suffering that would accompany it. He initially saw the weapon as potentially ending the war quickly, but now he saw that he had unleashed a power the world could not bear. When he returned to Washington after the war's end, he was received as a hero. But the soul within him was not the same one people saw. He felt his spirit burdened with an unbearable weight. In his first meeting with President Truman, he told him frankly, "I feel I have blood on my hands." This statement was enough for Truman to distance himself from him, later describing him as a crybaby scientist. The clash of visions was between two men representing contradictory poles, the scientist thinking of moral consequences, and the politician thinking of military victory. Oppenheimer returned to his scientific life, but he was not the same man. He began openly advocating for the necessity of international controls on nuclear weapons and for avoiding an arms race. He believed the world stood on the brink of an abyss, and that continued development of nuclear weapons would inevitably lead to disaster. This stance did not please some political leaders, especially amid the beginnings of the Cold War. His views began to be seen as a threat to security interests, and doubt started to surround him. The United States at that time was living in the atmosphere of McCarthyism, where accusations of communist loyalty spread without clear evidence. Oppenheimer, due to his past connections with some left-wing figures, was an easy target for these accusations. Over time, the government began to question his loyalty, despite his being one of the most important scientists who served the country. In 1954, a special committee held a hearing to investigate him. It was a harsh and humiliating session. Oppenheimer stood before investigators who doubted his intentions, his sincerity, his past, and even his personal relationships. He felt that everything he had done for the country was being erased before his eyes. In the end, his security clearance was revoked, effectively ending his role in government programs. This fall was cruel. A man who created one of the greatest scientific achievements in history was treated as a political outcast. He felt he was being punished not for what he did, but for what he tried to prevent, the nuclear arms race. Nevertheless, he did not turn into a resentful man, rather, he became a more calm and contemplative figure. He returned to scientific research and to reflecting on the relationship between science and responsibility. With his distance from politics, another side of his personality began to emerge, the philosophical thinker. He gave lectures on the nature of knowledge, the moral concept of science, and the limits of human capability. He believed that science, if separated from ethics, could turn into a destructive force. He spoke with a quiet voice, but he carried within him an experience no one else possessed, the experience of the scientist who witnessed with his own eyes the moment a weapon capable of ending civilization was created. After his dismissal from the political scene and the revocation of his security clearance, Robert Oppenheimer found himself alone, as if the world he helped shape began to turn its back on him. The fall was not just the loss of a position or influence, but a loss of trust, a loss of the status he had built over decades of effort and work. This left a deep imprint on his soul, an effect he could not get rid of, no matter how hard he tried. Nevertheless, he did not completely withdraw. With the support of his wife Kitty and a number of loyal colleagues, he returned to scientific and academic life through the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. That place included an elite group of brilliant minds, among them a scientist who had a great impact on contemporary scientific thought, Albert Einstein. Einstein, in turn, suffered from intellectual and political isolation after years of criticism directed at him for his anti-nuclear weapons stances. In the halls of Princeton, the two great scientists met, one who contributed to the understanding of the nature of time and the universe, and the other who opened the door to the power stored within the atom. They were different in temperament, but they shared a deep concern for humanity's future. They would stroll together along the nearby lake, exchanging conversation about science and politics, and about humanity's ability to control the power it created with its own hands. Einstein would always tell him, "The problem will not end as long as the weapon exists." While Oppenheimer would reply in a hushed voice, "But I was part of its beginning." Oppenheimer, at that stage, became a symbol of the thinker trying to correct the course of science. He gave lectures on the moral responsibility of scientists, advocating for science to be a force for knowledge, not destruction. He spoke about the relationship between power and knowledge, warning against the exploitation of scientific discoveries in political conflicts. His lectures received wide attention, both within and outside the United States. He became a rare voice that combined deep scientific expertise with a courageous moral vision. As time passed, his image began to improve in scientific and diplomatic circles. This was not the result of political change as much as it was an acknowledgement of the value of his stances. In the early 60s, he began to be invited to international conferences discussing nuclear arms reduction, and he always spoke cautiously and clearly, trying to convince the world that the arms race would only lead to collapse. Nevertheless, he was aware that his voice, no matter how rational, would not stop the wheel of the major powers racing to produce more weapons. During that period, the Cold War was at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union stood at opposite ends of the world, competing not only for political influence but for nuclear capability. Nuclear powers expanded, and the figures published about the number of warheads capable of destroying the planet were like a constant alarm bell. Yet, Oppenheimer continued his attempts to present a different vision, a vision based on rationality and understanding the limits of power. But his opponents continued to doubt his intentions, considering him a man with unrealistic ideas in a world governed by strict calculations. Amidst this intellectual conflict, his health began to deteriorate. He was diagnosed with throat cancer, an illness partly linked to his long-standing smoking habit. By early 1965, the disease progressed rapidly. He was losing weight, and his voice began to fade, as if life was slowly withdrawing from him. Yet, he did not stop writing or thinking. He would sit for long hours in front of his office window, gazing at the horizon, as if searching for something only he knew. On a cold winter day, Oppenheimer entered his room in his Princeton Island home and sat on his usual wooden chair. His wife was beside him, and signs of exhaustion marked his features. He said to her in a faint voice, "I tried. I tried to warn them." Then he held her hand and closed his eyes slightly, as if reviewing the reel of his life with all its triumphs and setbacks. He did not know that his last days were numbered. On February 18, 1967, Robert Oppenheimer died after a long battle with illness. The man who shaped the modern world departed in a way no one expected. His death was not a major media event at the time, as the Cold Wars and political crises dominated the headlines. But in the scientific community, his passing was the loss of a unique personality, a personality history has rarely known. Oppenheimer did not truly die, he remained present in the discussions about the relationship between science and politics, and in the great questions about the future of civilization. His phrase, "I am become death," was not forgotten, and it will remain forever associated with his name, perhaps because he was the only one who understood the reality of that power from the inside. Years after his death, the United States began to re-evaluate its stance toward him. In the 90s and early new millennium, new documents emerged confirming that he had never stood against the interests of his country, and that the accusations against him were exaggerated or inaccurate. Over time, he began to be seen as a man who paid the price for his intellectual courage, not as a traitor or someone whose loyalty was questioned. In December 2022, the U.S. government officially announced the annulment of the 1954 ruling and the rehabilitation of J. Robert Oppenheimer. This step came after decades of discussions that proved the accusations were political in nature, and that history had wronged the man who contributed to changing the course of modern science. The decision was late, but it came as an acknowledgement that the era he lived in was harsh and unjust. As the years pass, Oppenheimer's story has become more than just the biography of a scientist who made a bomb. It has become a mirror reflecting the nature of the nuclear age with all its contradictions, genius and danger, science and fear, power and responsibility. He has become a symbol of a larger phenomenon, the phenomenon of the scientist who realizes that knowledge alone is not enough, and that ethics are an integral part of any scientific progress. The name Oppenheimer has become linked to the most prominent moral question in our modern world: does humanity have the ability to control the power it creates? This question is not limited to physics but extends to technology, politics, and all aspects of civilization. Oppenheimer believed that knowledge unchecked by ethics could turn into a curse, and that power unconstrained by wisdom could lead to the end of everything. While nuclear technologies flourished after his death in the fields of energy and medicine, the nuclear weapon remains a constant threat, reminding the world of the moment Oppenheimer detonated a small sun in the New Mexico desert. The world has changed since that day, and thinking about humanity's future is always connected to that first fireball. Historians, scientists, and writers return to reading his letters, articles, and ideas, finding before them a complex man who cannot be reduced to the title of "father of the atomic bomb" only. He was a poet in his soul, a philosopher in his outlook, and a scientist in his methodology. He believed that the universe is an unending mystery, and that knowledge is a long road that requires humility before intelligence. Perhaps this blend is what made his personality captivating and his image unforgettable. Oppenheimer lived a life full of achievements, but also a life full of questions and doubts. He believed that humanity is capable of reaching the stars, but also capable of destroying itself. He believed that science could be a means of liberation, but he also saw that it could be a means of destruction. This contradiction is what makes his story approach a Greek tragedy, where the hero discovers his power, and then discovers that it may be the cause of his downfall. Thus, Oppenheimer transformed after his death into a modern legend, a legend carrying an important lesson, that science is not separate from humanity, and that the decisions made by scientists can determine the fate of the world. In our world, where technological developments are accelerating, Oppenheimer's story remains one of the most important stories that reminds us that progress does not come without a price, and that wisdom is the compass humanity needs more than ever. The Manhattan Project was not the end of Oppenheimer's journey, rather, it seemed to be the great turning point that would cast its shadow over the rest of his life. After the war ended, he emerged into the world a man burdened with more than he could express. Oppenheimer knew that the weapon he helped unleash would change the meaning of war, the meaning of power, and perhaps the meaning of existence itself. But this realization did not preoccupy him initially as much as his internal fears, which began to grow little by little until they became a daily nightmare. He was appointed director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and it seemed as if he was building a real intellectual city, gathering scientists from every specialization, opening the doors of research and contemplation to them, and giving them free rein to explore the unknown. In this place, Oppenheimer resembled the conductor of an intellectual orchestra, unifying its rhythms despite their different backgrounds and orientations. But behind this calm, knowledgeable face, an endless conflict was raging. He asked himself, did I uncover a new door to knowledge or open a gateway to the abyss? And can humanity extinguish a fire it lit with its own hands? His fears increased with the news of the nuclear arms race that began to ignite between the superpowers. The world seemed to him to be haunted by a weapon that was no longer just a tool of war, but an existential threat signaling the annihilation of humanity. Oppenheimer felt that every step toward developing this weapon was a step that moved the world away from peace and closer to catastrophe. Here, he gradually transformed from a quietly working scientist into a public figure who warned, debated, and called for the regulation of nuclear power and its placement under international control. This stance did not please decision-makers in the United States, especially in the era of the Cold War, when any voice calling for limiting power or openness to the world was considered suspicious. His past began to haunt him, old friendships with leftists, youthful gatherings, and unconventional political opinions. Although he never joined a political party, his mere intellectual connections with some of those circles were enough to start the campaign against him. Suspicion slowly began to weave around him. He suddenly transformed from the father of the atomic bomb to an untrustworthy person. With the increasing tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, any difference in opinion was interpreted as hidden loyalty, and every rational voice was considered a threat to national security. In 1954, a public hearing session was held that lasted for weeks. It was not just a formal session, it was a trial of his entire life, his history, his friendships, his convictions, and even his moments of human weakness. He stood there watching his image distort before a committee that did not want the truth, but wanted a ready-made conviction. At the end of that trial, the decision was harsh, the revocation of his security clearance. The decision was not just an administrative procedure, it was a declaration that the nation he helped achieve military superiority had decided to dispense with him, and even treat him as a stranger. His historical contribution turned into a burden, and the man who made the greatest scientific achievement in the war became a person who was no longer trustworthy. Oppenheimer returned to Princeton, but internally, he felt as if he was living in an open-air exile. He diligently performed his work, teaching, writing, and leading scientific discussions, but the shadow of the trial haunted him. Nevertheless, his attempts to influence human knowledge did not stop. He believed that his primary duty was science, and that his role had not ended yet, even if he was removed from nuclear policy. At the same time, Oppenheimer was not just a mathematician and physicist. He was a poet in his soul, a philosopher in his outlook on the world, and a voracious reader of Eastern and Western literature. He saw the atom as a world that transcended the laboratory's boundaries. He believed that knowledge was not just numbers and equations, but a responsibility that carried a deep moral dimension. Perhaps this very reason is why he felt the weight that accompanied him for the rest of his life. The famous quote he said after the detonation of the first atomic bomb, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," was not a poetic phrase, but a genuine echo of what he felt at that moment. He saw in that explosion something that transcended science, something akin to humanity confronting its destiny. As the years passed and the political climate changed, the world began to realize that Oppenheimer was not an opponent of the state, but a man seeking to protect humanity from the excess of power. Voices began to rise for his rehabilitation, until 1963, when he was awarded the Enrico Fermi Award, in recognition of his scientific contributions. This honor was an undeclared apology, an acknowledgement that what he had suffered was not justice. While he appreciated this gesture, the years he lost did not return, and the internal wounds did not disappear. He spent the last years of his life near the sea, in a tranquility he wanted as a refuge far from the noise of politics. He continued to lecture, write, and contemplate until his body began to fail him. In 1967, Oppenheimer passed away, leaving behind a legacy that the world is still debating today. A legacy built not only on science but on the moral questions he raised. Does science have limits? Can humanity control the power it creates? And does knowledge become a curse when it exceeds humanity's capacity to understand it? Oppenheimer passed away, but his questions remain alive, reminding the world that genius is not a constant victory, and that the greatest discoveries can be the heaviest burdens.